Stuart Johnston. For those that don't know me, I'm the telco media and technology leader here at Deloitte. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you this morning. This is our second mobile consumer survey. It's the third report that we release for our group each year, so it's hard to believe we're coming up to Christmas at a rapid rate. We'll be sitting here doing our TMT predictions for next year very soon. But this really follows off the back of the telco media tech predictions that we do at the start of the year, our media survey that we do in the middle of the year, and a number of you joined us for that. And then this is the second, as I said, the second mobile consumer survey for Australia, and the 6th or 7th globally for us as well. So this morning I'm going to hand over and let Jeremy Drum and Kate Huggins, who really authored the report from the insights that we gathered, and then we'll run through about a 20-minute presentation, and then we will open up to questions from all of you. So without further ado, I'll hand across the guy with the Canadian accent.
Hey. Thanks, Stu. Thanks, Stu. Okay, so agenda. We've got a few things to cover off. You have in front of you the media release, so we're going to hit the highlights within the release. And then Kate and I will go through a set of themes that we picked up on based on the survey and the survey results. So Stu touched on the fact that this is the second time we've run this survey here in Australia, the 5th time that we've run it globally. It is a survey that comprises, let's press the button down, 49,000 respondents globally across about 30 countries, covering across 5 continents. It is targeted here in Australia to the demographics between 18 and 75 of consumers, and about 2,000 respondents. So it does cover about 50-50 in terms of male-female, so we do have gender balance in there, and then across all of the states as well we've been able to cover. I guess the highlight theme and the title of the report is "Life's Smarter Than You Think," and this it comes down to your smartphones really. In Australia, it's no surprise, the smartphone absolutely is still, or it does reign supreme. So we're almost covered off that 80% mark in terms of the respondents here. 79% this year of our respondents have actually access to and are using actively their smartphones. This compares to last year, which was at 76%. And what this equates to is roughly, consumers. Sorry about that. Where do I want to go with this? We are, from a smartphone point of view, we are about in the middle globally in terms of where we're at penetration rate-wise. A lot of the Asian countries are much more penetrated, and there's a bit of a mixture in terms of European. We're ahead of Canada and we're ahead of the US, so tick on that front from my point of view. You'll note on the chart there that 32% of respondents are actually planning to purchase a new device next year, and that's consumers. What that equates to is consumer purchases next year of more than 5 million devices, and that's consumer devices next year. The other thing to call out on this slide too is quite interesting. We've seen a rather substantial uptick in tablets. So you'll see 44 to 59% in terms of respondents actually stating that they have access to tablets this year. So that's a substantial increase. The other interesting point there too is the fact that laptops have actually jumped as well from 71 to 77%. And then the other call out is the last two categories there around fitness bands and smartwatches. So this is something to note. Australia is of all the 30 countries that were surveyed, fitness bands were number 2 in terms of our penetration rate there. The only other country was China with a higher penetration there. So interesting to watch what trends happen there.
And that goes to our TMT predictions as well, doesn't it, Stu?
Yeah, absolutely.
We're absolutely predicting that.
Yeah.
So in terms of managing our multidimensional lives, next page really, what we're seeing here is, this again should come as no real surprise, but we're absolutely using our smartphones to drive our lives to be more effective, more efficient, and really to help us facilitate our day-to-day interactions. It's absolutely our go-to device, whether we're taking photos, and even with the new new smartphone, all the different features that you can actually use your smartphone for. hailing a ride, video calling, transferring money, and increasingly using it to actually help us actually get through our day-to-day activities. It is very much our personal remote for life, and it's in the palm of our hand. And for the most part, we're in control for the moment. This year, so again, we looked at how we're using our smartphone, and specifically what are the types of services and activities that we're using to help us facilitate our life, but also how we're communicating with our smartphone. And one of the questions we look at is, what is the first thing when you wake up and start to engage with your phone? What is the first thing that you actually use your smartphone for? And this is consistent with last year. We've seen that SMS is our go-to, and that could be related to the fact that most of our SMSs come through and sit on the front of our screen. But it is 27% of us actually, the first interactions we do have is with our SMS. But you'll note there that for those under 35, the first thing that we're doing is actually going straight on and checking and interacting with our social networks. That is an uptick from last year, and something that we're seeing more in terms of the trending pattern there around our communication through social, which Kate will cover off later on. The next
slide 9 we are for
slide
those on
9,
the phone.
yeah, thanks for that, Louise. Slide 9 touches on, we looked at this last year as well, and in the context of, I'd say probably many of us, the first thing we do, so notwithstanding turning off your alarm, which for those that use your phone for alarms, we discount that from the question, but it's when you actually engage with your smartphone. And what this chart shows that there are roughly 10%, 1 in 10 of us, the first thing we do right away is actually get on and jump and start to interact with a smartphone. For the youngsters 18 to 24, there's about 2 in 10. But 50% of us, by 15 minutes in, have actually actively engaged with and are starting to use our smartphone. So that's likely before we've brushed our teeth and anything like that. And it doesn't stop. So we turn it on, we wake up, we turn it on, we're engaging, and the engagement is intensifying. So 30 times a day is the average across the entire demographic. And you can look at the chart on the bottom on page 10 there, which actually does the profile in terms of the average number of interactions. And this is an engaged interaction with your smartphone. 56 times is the average for 18 to 24-year-olds. But interesting to note is that there is a spike for individuals over 200, and there's a few that are actually well over 250. So 5% of all respondents are actually actively engaging with their smartphone over 200 times a day. Collectively, as Australians, that equates to 440 million interactions, active interactions with our smartphone in a day. Pretty substantial. That then relates to, and Kate's going to cover off our need for speed.
Thanks, Jodie. So we've got a series of questions in the survey that look at the way we connect via various different devices. And I think there's some interesting stuff in here. So not too much change from last year. Wi-Fi remains Australians' preferred way of connecting to the internet. That does vary by device. So 59% of us prefer to connect via Wi-Fi when using our smartphone, and a large proportion, 89% of us, when using our tablets, which we might assume relates to their different level of mobility with those devices. I think it stands to reason that we'll connect to Wi-Fi when we're at home and when we're at work, where those Wi-Fi networks are readily available to us. And so the really interesting question becomes, what are we doing when we're on the move? What we find there, and we specifically ask a question, it's not shown here, but we ask a question about when you're out and about, how do you like to connect? And 21% of us, on average, are actively seeking out a Wi-Fi network when we're on the move. So there's a decent number of us that are looking for that free data ride, and that's significantly higher amongst the younger demographic. But we're not going to stop doing what we want to do in general if that Wi-Fi network isn't available. So only 14% of us would actively defer an activity that we might presume is a data hungry activity until we have that Wi-Fi access. So we're attributing this Wi-Fi seeking as a cost avoidance thing, this desire to avoid bill shock, and a desire to manage our monthly costs. But what we've seen change between last year's survey and this one is some greater preference or value put on the speed that we get through our 4G connection. Last year there was a little bit of confusion in amongst the respondents about the benefits of 4G versus Wi-Fi or 3G, whereas here we see that big jump up of from 40% to 53%, being very clear that their 4G speeds are faster. And so what we're seeing is that kind of trade-off, and there are differences demographically between price sensitivity versus speed sensitivity. We think that the shift will be from price sensitivity towards speed sensitivity as we become more and more reliant on those very data hungry aspects, and indeed as the pricing of connectivity changes, and we'll talk a bit about that in a second. The other thing to mention there is that people using 4G and experiencing the greater speeds, it changes their behaviour. So that people that are 4G subscribed do consume more data hungry apps. 4G subscriptions themselves have grown significantly since last year, so up from 27% to 41%. That's a reasonable jump in penetration, and 71% are really seeing and feeling the benefit of that faster rate of connectivity. I'm going to depart from the actual survey results just for a second, because I think while we're talking about Wi-Fi and connectivity, it's worth talking about how pretty much all of the telco operators in Australia this year have changed the way they package and price connectivity. So you might say that we're seeing the sharing economy hit the telco space. I think all of the operators now offer shared plans, so whether that's shared data, the ability to share your data across the devices that you own, or the ability to share data between family members. But perhaps the more interesting aspect of sharing that we're seeing is the ability to share bandwidth. So with Telstra, the Telstra Air product that launched earlier this year, the ability to turn your home broadband connection into a Wi-Fi hotspot and share it with your community of fellow Telstra customers. None of these are new to the world product innovations. All of these are localizations of models that have been tried and tested overseas. I think for some years we've had Verizon and AT&T doing sharing of data in their plans, and obviously FON was the pioneer of community Wi-Fi, and there are many other startups kind of getting into the Wi-Fi first space. And so when we look at Australian players, we might say, well, these are defensive postures being assumed against that backdrop of the threat of Wi-Fi first and of some of the big players like certainly Google and potentially Apple getting into the MVNO space. And so what really is that disruptive threat? It's about the connectivity and the carrier becoming less important than the software that sits over the top of that connectivity and actually controls that user experience. So I think we're kind of continuing to watch how local players observe some of those trends and make more innovative moves in the way they package and price data and connectivity more broadly in response.
Kate, when I was looking at FON, I didn't really know what FON was, and possibly everybody does, but we put it in the media release that it is this, it operates a dual access wireless system.
Yeah, they've got the biggest
And they're
Wi-Fi
the biggest in the
hotspot
world.
networks in the world, and they've done deals with lots of telcos, and to either provide Wi-Fi as a backup to the cellular network, or vice versa. If it's Wi-Fi first, then the cellular is the backup. So interesting space.
So the next theme we were going to cover was around the game of phones, and this is all about the battle of devices and how we compare globally. So, again, the powerhouse duopoly continues in Australia. So very much Apple, Samsung reigning over the market. 73%. It's gone up since last year. But in terms of, I guess, the winner and the company that's sitting on the Iron Throne for this year is Apple with 41% of penetration. That's, you can see from the chart, the domination from younger generation, or the younger demographics, is really what's driving that uptick. The other question that we look at here is around stickiness and loyalty. So brand loyalty amongst mobile consumers. And I guess what we've observed in this is the fact that Apple has almost this cult-like following in terms of its brand loyalty. So 61%, how you read this chart is, so the top left Apple circle there is, if you are a current Apple smartphone owner, where was your previous device, or what was your previous device? 61% of current Apple smartphone owners had a iPhone before, and you can follow through there with 47% Samsung, Nokia at 57%, which is quite a loyal following as well, and the others tend to fall off. What that says is that as a marketplace, Australians are actually quite loyal, and this is a little bit different than global. So we're 46% of consumers are actually putting their hand up and saying, I'm pretty loyal to my brand, and that then, if you follow that through in terms of 5 million or so smartphones so more than 5 million consumer smartphones will be purchased next year, it equates to about 2.3 should actually follow through straight to their current brand. I've touched on this slide, so we might pass right through it. The other piece that we picked up on, and I think this will become increasingly more interesting in future surveys, but we want to bring it through this year so we can talk about it next year as well, which is really around connected devices. And this is all about the fact that as an Australian marketplace, consumers are quite comfortable, and sometimes they know that they have these devices, sometimes they don't, but 52% of us actually have a connected device. And I think that's it's ahead of global averages. So we are on the front foot in terms of our willingness to purchase and increasingly use connected devices in ways that they're intended. The most popular, as you can see there, gaming consoles and smart TVs are ruling the charts. And I've already touched on the fitness band and smart watches in terms of their uptick. I guess it's interesting to note, so the 4% there, it's a slightly different number than the chart at the front. This relates to smartphone users in terms of this specific chart, so it's a little bit more focused in terms of the base. Within that, one of the things we wanted to call out was this survey was done in May of this year, and that was 2 months after the Apple Watch was released. We reckon this number is going to go up and up and up in the next year, specifically because of 50% of the early adopter demographic within the survey are suggesting that they're going to purchase a smartphone in the next 12 months. So we actually do expect this number to go up in the next 12 months.
Just one other quick point on this slide too is that when we did we asked this sort of question in our media survey a couple of years ago, we found people saying, we don't have connected TVs, when a number of people when connected TVs were just being shipped. So we weren't using them, or we weren't perceiving and understanding they were connected. If you take that, so now we're actually recognising and using our smart TVs. We think it's going to be the same with connected cars. There's a lot more than 3% of the cars on the market that are connected when you think about sat-nav, the way you can stream music into them, etc. It's just that we don't perceive them as being connected.
And I think
so there's always this interesting thing where the consumer, we all look at it from within the industry and go, it's connected. Consumer may not see it.
I think that's
but the behaviour follows on very quickly.
I think that's right. It's that 52 is 52%. Maybe one way to read that is 52% of Australian consumers know that they have ready access to a connected device. Yeah. When in reality, it's probably a lot higher for that point, right, Stu?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, they're always there. Even things like Apple TV, going back, that's a connected device, but no one would even think of that terminology.
So one of the themes we picked up on as well is just kind of this opportunity versus danger in usage. So the first kind of interesting stat relates to, despite the fact that there's lots of press and publication around the known implications, health implications around too much screen time, especially right before going to sleep. Many of us, and I'm sure we're probably all in that camp of the last thing we do is actually engage with our smartphone before going to sleep. This is particularly high amongst the 18 to 24-year-olds, where 21% of them are actually the last thing that they do is interact in a meaningful way with their smartphone before going to sleep. 56% of us, actually, if we think about the warnings that have been put out there, it's turn off your phone, no screen time 30 minutes before. So half of us are actually ignoring those warnings. Another question that we looked at this year was this nature of multitasking, and we asked the question, so you're using your smartphone, but what are you doing in addition to that at the exact same time? And this chart breaks down that there's quite a large number of other activities that are in the survey as well. These are the ones that kind of draw out for us. And there's a few in here that I'd call out is using public transport. So 88% of us are actively engaging with our smartphone while we're on public transport. I don't think that comes as a surprise. I was on the ferry coming into work the other day, and I was just reflecting on 5 years ago. I'd be on the ferry, and there'd be people with their paper. Some people actually even having conversations with each other. Yesterday morning was literally, there was just people buried in their smartphones. So just such a different dynamic, and it runs through in terms of the findings. 83% of us are dual screening or multi-screening. So we're using our smartphone, we're actually actively watching television, and that actually follows through on the media consumer survey that Stu mentioned. It's a very similar point that we made there. One of the interesting points that isn't on the slide is one for those with kids, teenage kids. So 18 to 24-year-old, that demographic, 91% of them are actively using their smartphones when they are having quality time with mom and dad. So it shouldn't really come as a surprise, but 91% it seems quite high. It's quite an interesting one. The two other points to flag in terms of the quote-unquote danger relates to the stat. 42% of Australians are admitting to using their phone while walking across the street, as well as driving. Now, that might sound like a danger, but there's a quick caveat with that, is they could be using it for streaming, so streaming Spotify, or using it for GPS and navigation. So we didn't get to the layer of granularity of the follow-through on the question, but it is an interesting one to note that 42% are actually using their smartphone in some meaningful way while driving. Might pass through that one, Louise. Retail reinvented, so banking and mobile payments specifically. So I guess the announcement yesterday by Apple kind of played quite nicely into some of this. We spent a bit of time on this last year. I think really excited about what was going to happen in the next 12 months, and quite clearly there's been some stalls and in terms of Apple Pay being released. So yesterday's announcement, is an indication of, let's see, progress. We'll see. But so some of the findings that we touched on here, this one relates to the fact that nearly 2/3 of respondents under 35 had made online purchases using their smartphone. So that's a pretty substantial 65%, in fact. I think that we're slightly behind the global average here. So 42% of all demographics are using their smartphone to actually purchase. And we called out this on the chart on the left here, the fact that there is quite a substantial difference between users on 4G versus users on 3G in terms of both their browsing, but also actually converting a browse into a purchase, with 57% of consumers on their smartphone making online purchases versus 32% of 3G users on their smartphone. And on the right-hand side of the chart there, you can see that quite clearly the younger, which is a good thing for retailers, the number and percentage of younger generations using their smartphone actively to make online purchases is quite substantial there. The question, and this was the one that we touched on last year, and I think we were all quite interested to see how this translated into reality. And what this question was, if you could use your smartphone as you would your credit card or your bank card, how many would you actually use that in a retail setting? Last year, 40% of us said, yep, absolutely, we'd be willing to do that. 19% said not too sure, need to figure out a little bit more, and 41% of us said no. This year, we've taken quite a substantial jump back. So only 24% of us this year has said that we were comfortable of using our smartphone to actually pay versus using our bank or credit card. This is an interesting point. I think Stu and I were having a conversation. Is there something really really interesting in this or not, or is it just that what's the benefit? Why would I just take out my credit card? So why would I use my smartphone as opposed to just taking out my credit card and tapping? So until such time that we're all just going like this, or we're all just some way making the process a much easier thing to do, a better experience, we don't see this being a substantial uptick. But it is an interesting one to call out there.
Or I think it's also about the consumers become more educated.
Absolutely.
So I think today, the one thing that consumers don't think about is that there's the $100 limit on the credit card for tap and go.
That's
So
right.
our tap and go infrastructure in Australia is one of the most advanced in the world. So you get people come from the US and they say they can use their Apple Pay infrastructure here much more easily. I think once we become educated as consumers and know that actually the phone's more secure, the transaction value that we'll be able to do on the phone is likely to be greater than the $100 limit.
But I mean, it's not
Credit
it's not
card.
a $100 limit. It's a $100 limit after which you have to type in your PIN code.
That's right.
But you can still, put $1,000 and tap it. It'll just say, sorry, it's
Tap and
$100.
go.
Put in
Yeah,
your,
it's
put in
still
your
But
code.
it's different.
But that's no different to the swipe. It's tap and go.
Sure. I mean, the difference
the
is the difference is you don't have to swipe it or insert it. But so it's. I mean, the limit's there just to stop people from stealing your card and then going on a spending spree because they
Yeah.
won't know your
Yeah.
PIN code.
Yeah.
So you can spend whatever you want.
But the reality is the way there is that the phone
Simplicity of
is
it.
far more secure, and this is just an education and perception.
Yeah.
The phone is much more secure than a credit card.
Especially if they're using tokenization where they randomise.
That's right.
Absolutely.
Exactly.
You can't have them. People are walking around at the moment just swiping the backs of.
Yeah.
There's a whole range of reasons that $100 limit's there. So,
Yeah.
but I think it's just consumer education.
Yeah.
It's always we always say these sort of questions. The closer you get to the reality, the higher the more theoretical the question, the lower our response always is.
But I think you're also going to be up against the fact that most people, when they go shopping and they tap and go, it's going to be under $100, and your credit card is the battery never goes flat on your credit card.
Yeah.
And that's what.
Yeah.
And that's what all the
battery life.
card companies will admit to if you talk to them, all the phone
Yeah.
companies.
That's right. Yeah. So Stu touched on some of the points on this slide here. You can see
Slide 28.
all of the various downward trajectories in terms of last year, this year, about the types of retail situations in which we're disinclined to be using our phones. And I guess the stat that came through was, and you slightly touched on it, about 54% perceive no real benefit from using their smartphone as a credit card style payment. The number one driver was actually security. So 43% of respondents said that their perception, and it is very much a perception because to a large extent the phone is actually a more secure device than using your tap and go. But the perception, 43%, is the main driver behind them not using it.
And just one thing to add, I kind of feel like if just the convenience of swiping with your phone isn't enough to drive it, there's got to be some other benefit in there, and whether that's the ability to jump the queue or
Yeah,
whether that's
that's
the
a great
ability to hail a ride more quickly,
Yeah.
it's wrapping payment in the context of a broader user experience that's going to drive usage of phones for payment.
Yeah.
To that point, Kate, I
There are
think the
three.
cinema tickets, the fact that you can jump the queue at movies because you've already booked it on the internet and not have to stand in line
Yeah.
is probably something that's going to help consumers shift over that perceived kind of like, why am I not using my phone to buy?
Until everybody books online and then you got to wait in the queue.
Exactly. It's just
In that queue.
You
It's
move,
queue
the,
shifting.
you move the point of sale.
That's
But the other way though too.
You need to have
would be-
e-tickets on your phone.
Yeah, I think as retailers and others figure out how to use location-based data, and as the data that can be collected from the phone and the intersection between that where I am and what I'm buying, and then that becomes valuable, we'll start to receive incentives to use the phone.
Yeah.
Over. So I think, you know, the point around what's the benefit, not there today, but that retailers will make it, you know, Woolworths and others will be wanting that data.
There'll be a million
And
apps
they'll make
with
the,
where embedded payment by the phone
Yeah,
is
that's right.
part of the experience.
There is a significant role. Is it disillusionment amongst early adopters that's driving that, or you know, it's been on an upward trajectory?
It was, yeah.
And that seemed to be there, and that does actually
It's a
very
big
steep
drop, isn't
drop.
it? Yeah.
So what do you put that down to? I mean, are the banks cocked it up with the early digital wallets?
I think my thing here, because it's not longitudinal, the one thing you would say, what might have been driving that higher number last year would have been the hype around
Anticipation.
the launch of the Apple i6, the iPhone 6. There was marketing around it. There was a lot of awareness around it at the time.
And then it wasn't available in Australia.
And it wasn't available. So everyone was sort of like, I think, responding to marketing that was in the market. This year there's not that marketing there, and we all just go, oh yeah, I'll use the cap, tap and go. So I think it's just closer to reality. It's lost
It's
momentum
not
because
been
the
available in
reality is
Australia.
it's not there today.
Although with Apple announcing Amex on Apple Pay in Australia and Canada by the end of the year sometime, it's probably going to kick off
But
again.
it's Amex.
It is.
Yeah, it's Amex, yeah.
There will be-
Because
there'll
the
be-
banks are too greedy with the Visa and MasterCard.
There'll
But
be-
Alex,
Amex
there will be
charges
PayWave.
charges
There will be
more.
PayWave in Australia in the next 2 years.
Yeah.
It may not be Apple, but there'll be PayWave here. The banks will. Yeah.
EFTPOS is on the way to that, but I mean, the banks have their own proprietary systems. If you Commonwealth Bank or Westpac, you can do it anyway, and you've been able to do it for 2 years.
Yeah.
So with tokenisation.
Yeah.
So I don't. I think Amex and Apple is just out of desperation. 'Cause they
Yeah,
both
that's right.
Well, they want to tick the box. They want to be able to say they've
Gotta
done
say
it.
it's-
Sophie or Hannah?
My personal
Sorry,
view.
Bennett.
Sorry. Yeah.
Any questions from you on this topic?
With the 42% of people using their phone while crossing the road or driving, so you don't have any further granularity on that whatsoever. They're just using their phone.
Yeah, so we didn't go to the next level of what are you using your phone while actually doing that other activity. So the multitasking, so to speak, we didn't get to that.
And this was 2,000 people. So if I just get 42% of 2,000, that would be the people figure.
This would be on a base of smartphone users, which is about
Yep.
just under 1,600 was the smartphone base.
Mm-hmm.
So if you take 80% of the population, and then this is an 80% penetration rate of smartphones, and then multiply that percentage number there, you get a total population
Okay.
number.
And the subtleties as well there you could see in the chart in terms of what they responded with. So always or very often,
Yeah.
sometimes, hardly ever. So when I use when we talked about 42%, it's for all those that had done it. Does that make sense? So it's excluding
yes,
the
absolutely.
nevers.
Yeah. And then some of those have said hardly ever, but they're still admitting.
That's
Yeah.
right. That's it, exactly.
Sophie, any question whilst we just got this question break?
Yeah, I do. On page 5, the mobile penetration for Australia being the highest in the world.
Yep.
Do you have a breakdown of the other countries?
Yeah, we will. So some we do. Why
That
don't
was
we
the one
send
we
you?
put forward a bit further on.
Yeah, so we do. The penetration is and there's a mixture on this. Page 19. So it does talk to a number of the countries. Interestingly, some of the countries are not sharing their data just yet, which is a bit pesky, to be honest. But you can see where we sit relative to others there. So, for example, Australia ahead of the UK, Germany, Canada, France, Japan, and there are others as well that we're ahead of, but well behind the likes of Singapore, which is top of charts, I believe, 92% penetration rates. South Korea, which we'll get some numbers on in the future, but last year they were second. Spain, China, etc.
Japan's a weird outlier for us. We still can't get underneath because there's smartphones all over. You go to Tokyo and everyone's using smartphones, so it's always just a bit of a a weird one around what's the definition or what's going on in the survey there.
How did you
So
define
how does that work then? Because it's saying here Singapore's 92%.
Yep.
I'm a bit confused. Sorry.
Yeah,
So you're saying.
Yeah. So in
So
Singapore.
how's Australia leading? I want to know basically
the
how
figure?
we're number one in penetration and adoption.
No, I don't think we said
Of
that.
tablets.
No, you said something like that.
On page 5, it says Australia currently leads the world average in penetration and adoption of smartphones and tablets.
Oh, okay,
It's one of
that's-
the leaders.
Yeah.
That was
Okay.
supposed to be.
Fair. No, that's slightly. That's not correct.
That's me falling on my sword by the sound of things,
Yeah.
Sophie.
Right.
It is
Okay.
it is a leader. It isn't leading.
Right, okay.
Would it be fair to say we're above the world average?
We are above the world average, absolutely, in smartphones
I think
and especially in tablets. At 59 versus 54. So yes, absolutely. And there are other measures in terms of where we're leading in terms of adoption of services and how we're interacting and using through social. And Kate's going to cover these off. I want to make sure we finish up on the point that's coming through around messaging and social.
We've still got time.
so. Can we have a breakdown of the countries
Yeah.
of smartphones and tablets and penetration,
Yes, we
Yeah.
can get that for you.
please?
Yeah,
Will
send
do,
that through,
Sophie.
yeah.
I'm looking at Ned.
All right. Anybody on the phone need a question just now before we just kick into the last little part about instant messaging and SMSFs? Simon.
Just
or
going back to that,
Julia?
Louise, are we able to just elaborate on why the average, our penetration here is so high? Like, is there a couple of core things we can pull from that? I know we've discussed a lot this morning, but why is that the case? Why are these penetration levels here relatively high in Australia?
I think
Do
it's
we know that?
I think the first thing is we are known as and we're known for being early adopters of technology. The one thing that's probably not sort of why, we are seen by a number of global tech companies as a great place to come and test because of our willingness to adopt technology earlier. And then we're quite representative of a number of different countries globally. So Australians are, despite sometimes the perception, we are pretty high adopters. The second is our our mobile networks. We had the most advanced for a long time mobile networks in the world.
Yeah.
And so hence the adoption and usage of the devices, we were ahead, for example, of the US. So where, Singapore, South Korea, and some of the Scandinavian countries certainly they rolled out their their 4G networks and even 3G networks at about the same time. The US has been lagging for a long time. So that's part of it as well. So it's both our willingness to adopt as a consumer and it's the infrastructure that we've had as well, has then, I believe, driven that adoption rate and why we're seen to be we're amongst the leading nations when it comes to the sort of adoption.
So the use of 30, I think it was 30 times a day.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That we look at our screen on average, I think it was. But is that fair to say we've got an addiction to these devices or not?
I think that's what we said
That
last
seems
year.
a lot.
That is what we said last year. Are we addicted? I think what we're also seeing is the fact that it's not just about the notifications as it used to be. So it's more we're actually proactively engaging. So actually checking in more frequently. It's not just coming at us. It's that as well. But how we're engaging with I don't want to say it. We're not addicted to our smartphone because I don't think that's what we want to.
I think it's that we're
across,
using I think the reason that you see the usage go up is what we use. It's not like we're all of a sudden just still doing the same. We're doing more with the smartphone. So every year we're doing more and more with it. So it's gone from just using it for telephone calling to messaging to now checking the weather to shopping.
We're smarter.
It is the go-to device. We use that more and more. We're watching media on it. It's we listen to music from it. So it's almost every time someone creates a different way to use that device, we're willing to adopt it and we're happy to continue to use it. And so hence why so many interactions, and it'll probably just continue climbing as well, I think.
Yeah.
I suggested, I wouldn't be surprised if we could look at the number of apps we have on our phones and things as a good indicator
Yeah,
of
that's
that.
right.
Yeah, that's right.
It's useful.
All right, Kate, bring us home.
Okay, just shooting through.
So the last section is a little bit tongue-in-cheek. Grandma's taking selfies, but there's some really interesting findings around IM. I think last year we talked about the IM wave really building, and this year it's certainly hit Australian shores. So instant messaging use jumped nearly 70% this year, admittedly off a low base in those older demographics, but you know, a really significant shift there, which we find quite interesting. The other thing to note, I think, is that among the 18 to 24 demographic, where use of IM has actually overtaken the use of voice.
And we think there's two things, and we discussed this last night with a number of industry leaders, there's two things driving the adoption of IM. One is firstly just older age demographics going to and using those apps that drive IM versus the simple text messaging. The second is, as we become more multi-device, so on the one hand, SMS is actually a way to get from one phone to many phones. Instant messaging is actually the way to get from one device to multiple devices. So in other words, I may not, if I send a text message, I'll only get to telephones. Sorry, let me turn that off. Whereas if I send an instant message, I'll get to tablets, I'll get to a range of other devices. So there's sort of that crossover where, because we're using multiple devices more, we're now using instant messaging.
And you can also have the messages that you've sent be synced across different devices too,
That's
which
right.
is very handy.
Yeah, that's right.
Moving on to the next slide. So taking photos. You know, I think you could put a reasonable case to say that the camera in your phone or photo taking, perhaps along with social, is kind of the killer app for the smartphone, or has been over the last few years. You know, this survey shows that 95% of smartphone users have cited use of it for taking photos, which is the most frequently cited activity. And that's consistent across all demographics. I think you know, the social aspect is interesting. So on the next page, what we're seeing is, you know, that we're not just using the functionality of the camera phone, we're obviously sharing those photos more frequently, and that sort of symbiotic relationship, as we share more, we'll take more photos as well. So even though it's only 8% posting photos weekly to social, you know, that's still a significant increase on last year. And I think what's interesting as we see the older demographic going social, is that then makes them significantly more likely to adopt the other, you know, services and applications that might hit the mobile universe. You know, that there's definitely a relationship there. If you can see, if grandma can see her kids and her grandkids doing something, then she's more likely to adopt as well. I think the other interesting stat that's not actually on the slide is the gender difference in terms of photo sharing. So women are much more likely to share photos, which is why we talk about grandmas taking selfies. But across all demographics, I was surprised to see that apparently 41% of men have never shared a photo on social media. So there's something about men that are a little bit more private. Someone at the dinner last night suggested it was because their wife shares their photos for them, so they don't need to. But yeah, there was a difference there.
It's from the older age going.
And being a grandma, I can absolutely say that I certainly do.
I'm sure you do.
You're also an early adopter, though.
An Aussie.
There is just one final comment here, I think, on the use of video. I think it's no surprise, obviously, we are consuming video to a far greater extent on our phones this year than we were last year. Yeah, I think things like Facebook's autoplay of videos has been a big factor there, but a lot more of us are watching TV, news, short videos over our mobile phones. I think the other interesting thing we were talking about this, Alex, earlier was the relationship between the photo and the video, and is the video just an extension of the photo? And certainly on the new Apple phone, the Apple iPhotos application means that as a default, a series of frames around a photo being taken. So, just to bring it back to how these new uses of our phones penetrating that older demographic, I think that there is some research that shows that tablets as an entry device for the older demographic, kind of introducing our grandparents to smartphones. So they often go tablet first and then mobile phone. Secondly, that photos are kind of the entry application for that older demographic, and are getting them into that more creative space of not just passive users of their smartphones, but active participants in social networks, and that social itself is the accelerator of adoption of new services for that older demographic.
And with Channel 9 offering new live TV from next year, live TV will certainly increase.
Yeah.
Should.
And I'm sure Seven and everyone else will copy them.
Yeah.
Live TV streaming Nirvana.
Yeah. I mean, my big question of all this is, when do we stop calling them smartphones?
Well,
You
I've read
really
the same
step
thing.
back
It's
and
just a
think
phone
about
now.
it. It's a device that looks about the same size as a phone, but not, a lot of what we're using these devices for isn't as a phone. So, in 10 years' time, I reckon everyone will look back and go, why did you call them smartphones? But anyway, that's as much as a summary in terms of, an observation of just what we use these things for.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think we just call them phones because it's a one-syllable word.
Yeah.
And a phone will just come to mean all these different things. I mean, it means that today.
Yeah.
For the
There are still a fair few feature phones knocking around.
Sure. There are. But
That's our formal sort of presentation completed, folks. So we've got some time still in the diary for any questions from you guys on whatever agenda that you're particularly running with.
Question for Stuart, really.
Beverly.
Once you've got all of this, where's the benefit for this for Enterprise Australia knowing this? I mean, I can see the headlines tomorrow about what this is, but where do your clients, where does Enterprise Australia get leverage from knowing this? Knowing what that demographic is doing.
It's a really good question. I think first and foremost, it just really underpins the need for Australian businesses to be rethinking how they interact with consumers across all dimensions of their business. And the really interesting example, and put aside some of the regulatory issues that have been discussed, but Uber is founded around a mobile device and an app.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, we connect and a social platform. We can pay, we can interact, we can see each other. It uses the Maps function that was invented here in Australia. It does transactional capabilities. It's got social capabilities in terms of providing feedback. They have reinvented a business model all off the core of mobile and our use of mobile and our comfort with using mobile for maps, social and transactions. So it encapsulates what I think is all Australian business needs to look to do, is how do you reinvent a business model? How do you find the friction points and smooth those friction points? And it's great we're behaving, but it's an insight into our behaviour, so it's a huge opportunity.
In fact, Stu, just to amplify that point, we've actually got the general manager of Uber coming to talk to us on Friday in a financial services space. And yesterday, Uber celebrated its 10 millionth customer in Australia in just 1 year. And it's all through exactly what Stu says. It's kind of like taking the friction or the difficulty out
Uber
of
has
hailing
10
a
million
cab.
customers in Australia.
It's probably right.
10 million
Rides.
Right.
Yeah, otherwise
Right.
everyone can stress.
Excuse me.
That's a big number.
Isn't it?
Yeah.
It's
10 million rides,
extraordinary.
it was funny. I took an Uber X ride yesterday.
Just in a year.
It was the guy's second day as an Uber X driver.
Yeah.
He's told me he'd been here for 20 years, but like his command of English didn't sound like he'd been here for 20 years. It sounded like he'd been here for 20 seconds. And he was complaining about picking people up in the city. It's like he hadn't driven in Sydney before, and I obviously I knew where I was going and I could direct him home, but I mean,
So you
it
had a
would have
bad experience.
it would have been a
did you?
disaster. Well, look, I gave the poor guy 5 stars because I thought, trying to encourage him, but I mean, the guy needed some serious training, and I mean, if it was somebody else in the car, they would have been afraid. They would have been scared. The guy didn't know what he was doing.
It's not. Yeah, I think.
And that's Uber X. That's very different
I took
to
Uber
regular
X
Uber.
last night home, and
Yeah.
I was home in a ticket.
Yeah, I mean,
for
I've had
half
one
the
other
cost.
I've had one other great journey through it,
Yeah.
and it was great. But I mean, this guy was
But
just.
I think
How
the-
do you
the
have that
key-
same experience in a taxi as well, though?
You could, yeah. I have been
I-
in taxis where it's the guy's second day or whatever.
But the key is the way in which the business model's been changed.
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh yeah.
So at the end of the day, really, it's the essence, and it's all around that mobile device. So I think to your question, it's all about how do you take that example and use when you really think about it and put aside there's all the debate around Uber, in some ways, but it's a great example about how they've used all these great functionality within the phone to create a business model.
Yeah.
Mapping, transactions, social. It really does use just in one little device. It's used it as it's a platform. The mobile really is the platform for new business models.
Can I continue on just a little bit step further? So we're talking about video streaming and all of that stuff. Looking at the banking we're on or any other service you like. The banks are heading towards having, say, interaction on ATMs where you've got to talk to someone in a call centre. Do you see that happening on a phone? I know you can do it by Skype and some possibly, but do you see that happening on a mobile phone if you wanted to do banking or, at a higher level? And if so, or do you see that? I've got a question follow up. Do you see that happening? Are you talking to your banking clients? Tell you they're looking at that, having people interacting with banks on a not just a phone call but a streaming vision. Do you see that happening?
So, I don't think any of us here are financial services specialists. We all specialise in TMT. But certainly speaking from a TMT perspective, there's a lot of work being done right now in terms of virtual delivery of customer service, whether that's through virtual agents, whether that's through live chat, whether that's through crowd support. And so, yeah, absolutely the mobile phone and that as a method of receiving support.
Can I interrupt there and amplify that? Because Joel Littman, we've just produced a document which is the World Economic Forum, which we've worked with, which is identifying some of the 11 innovations that are completely going to disrupt financial services, and the mobile phone is endemic in many of them.
Yeah, but I would say one of the things that I was chatting to the head of Tesco Bank last week. The way I would say it is that this is a broader trend. Where the first thing a lot of organisations, not just banks, are doing is the first step is just remove the friction point. So the first question is, do we need that friction point? Or if you look, I think, to telehealth, telemedicine, where the human interaction is still valued, then they are doing it. So the question will be, I think, will financial services go down that path where it's around advice? It's when I actually, so I think we're seeing things where the interaction of it with a human is valued, it translates into the device.
That's sort of
And I
what
think that's the key.
That's sort of what I was thinking. And if you get that far, so the next question would be, I don't know whether you guys are going to answer that. When you ring a lot of these places up, they say your call will be recorded for training purposes or whatever. How are they, if you start doing that, you're going to be recording video, which is going to be a huge amount of storage. How does that all fit? Especially with data retention laws and all of that. I mean, there's going to be a limit to where people are going to be using phones, and do you see that going anywhere?
Yeah, there's a few parts to your question there, isn't there? There's the choice of do you want to see an individual and versus a voice. I think. See, my question is more how will you change that business model? Because often when I talk to clients, they're really talking about today without the friction, as opposed to what's a different way of doing this. And so I think if you think about the number of times we ring the call centres today and how does that translate, most of us would just prefer not to call a call centre. So I think the number of times, what we call and have FaceTime for will be different. We'll store the story, we'll sort the storage, or the storage problem seems to be being solved, and with the cost just running down. So I know it's a bit of a roundabout, but I think you're right, but I don't think we can say those voice calls are going to translate to face calls.
I think the more interesting thing of voice versus face is whether the phone and the algorithm that sits within the services on that phone can give better advice than the person, the advisor. You know, if they've got access to more data and more contextual information about the person asking for advice, then you know.
Yeah.
Interesting.
But again, I guess you go back. Medicine's doing it. Medicine's actually they're doing telemedicine. And you know you think about the recording there and the implications of good or bad advice. So I think it's possible. But just how does the business model and the consumer need follow that?
Thank you. On the phone, Mumbrella or IDG, have you got any questions, Simon or Julia? Not hearing.
Hi, Simon here. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Yeah, look, I'm just interested. I mean, you're talking about, you know, the need for people to sort of reinvent their business model to encompass this, and a lot of marketers are talking about, you know, the experience that's being delivered. I mean, Uber has obviously been used as a great example of encompassing all the touch points. Do you see any other examples emerging, and do you see any other opportunities that aren't really being embraced at the moment by marketers and by enterprise to further connect with consumers by these devices? You know, particularly when obviously they're referencing them so frequently during the day. It's clearly a much better touch point out there now than connecting with consumers than probably any other medium.
So one example would be the experimentation that Westfield is now doing with beacons in the Westfield stores, but they are thinking about, but again it'll be more, they are thinking about what do they do with the eyeballs. So I think it's interesting. I do think there are examples of people starting to experiment in different ways rather than simply trying to migrate, like how do we just send advertising to people. I think they're starting to think about what are they going to do, and they're trying to experiment. Trying to think of other examples.
Well, the only other one there's two other examples within the report. The one that I love and I use about every single day is Beat the Queue, which again is about drawing you in early to your retail experience and following through all the way to you picking up your coffee. I use it for coffees. It's just a really quick ordering, but it has redefined the way that I experience my coffee every single day. It's so much faster and it's just a better experience. So I think that's one that has absolutely worked.
The business model changes, and I'm really happy, Simon, to send you some of that work that we're doing with the World Economic Forum around some of the business model changes that things like mobile are really driving, and also you go on.
Yeah, that'd be great if you could shoot me over that.
That'd be a pleasure. And also the point that Stu was making with regards to Westfield, we've also got a document where we look at a couple of case studies, including Australian Super, for instance, and some of the work that they're doing in terms of business model change as well. Again, using mobile or crowdfunding and crowdsourcing, which is again disrupting a business model and how it was used, and we've got that in a document called Harnessing the Bang, and I'll send that to you too, Simon.
The other thing I wanted to ask about was just the shifting, and I mean you looked at the data sharing plans, obviously Telstra setting up at the wireless networks. It's because there is now so much. I mean, I walked into an Optus store the other day to get my kid a phone, and while we were there we looked at my account, and just on the spot they upped my data from 3G to 8G with no extra cost. It's pretty clear that even while Telstra invests a lot of money in setting up the wireless network, and the study shows that people are more comfortable with wireless but see 4G as faster. Do you see a point at which wireless, the availability of Wi-Fi might actually be sort of lost in the fact that our data plans are enough to eat the the media that we want to consume and the stuff we want to consume anyway? Is there a danger that Wi-Fi is going to sort of fall off the table?
No, there's a really important thing that it's Wi-Fi. I think one thing will be that the first thing I'd say is that we will get to the point where we'll have one data plan. We're not going to think about a Wi-Fi data plan, a home plan, etc. It'll just be a data plan to access data. And then I think the technologies we use to access that data is then just, because there's big differences, and 4G, you can get congestion. So I think it'll end up being, I've got a data plan, I can access the network, and then I'll become less aware of whether I'm using Wi-Fi or 4G. Because there are situations where Wi-Fi works better than 4G and vice versa. We'll have, spectrum will come on, but you can still get congestion. There's the issues with with 4G networks, where if you get a lot of people in the net, you can't virtualize the 4G network at the moment. So there's a number of reasons where I think the point I would make, we'll become less aware of the network type that we're using. We'll just access data wirelessly, and we'll move more seamlessly between them.
Certainly
Right? Wi-Fi will never replace 4G for the foreseeable future.
Certainly in the Australian market, as you were saying, the 4G network, the cellular network isn't as congested in urban centres as in other countries, and so the need for Wi-Fi offloading isn't as strong. Yeah. Secondly, the public Wi-Fi network in Australia isn't as ubiquitous as in some other markets, all of which afford some protection to the telco operators and their profits. That said, there is undoubtedly, the direction of data pricing is quite strongly downwards, and towards the free, and it's incumbent upon all telcos to look for ways of monetizing new services that have value to customers, in addition to the straight connectivity.
Good, Simon. You've got the answers that you're looking?
Yep, I've got what I need.
Thank you. And Julia, how are you? Not hearing. Bennett? Harry and Bev?
All good, thank you.
Fantastic. So we've got an early mark. Appreciate that, everybody. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
And if you've got any queries, don't hesitate to give me a ping me for something. You're most welcome.
He was great.